Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for staying until the very last presentation on the very last session on the very last day to listen to little old me talk about some research. My name's Zhou. I'm a upcoming fifth-year PhD candidate at BU, and I'm very excited to present a joint work with an amazing supporting cast. DK, who's not here, but we have Gord Birch. We have, is Daniel here? Oh, that's a shame. All right. And then Daniel Rock and Sunny Tombe. Thank you so much for your generous support on this. And very excited to present Creative Markets in the Age of Generative AI, Strategic Shifts, and Labor Market Health. And so a lot of my work up to this point in my career has been looking at how has human creativity adapted to the introduction of generative AI, and specifically how has creative workflows evolved, how has that corresponded to changes in hobbyist behaviors. But really I wanted to translate that to how is it actually impacting the labor market for these creative individuals. And so I thought a lot about potential analogies for what might be happening with generative AI these days, and really thinking back to the 1990s with the introduction of, say, Photoshop. These digital art tools really granted artists new capabilities that were previously unable to be replicated in traditional media. So we're talking about things like editing, your favorite Control-Z undo button, layering, and special effects. And really what this enabled creators to do was to still produce largely the same types of artworks, but with improved workflow efficiency and artifact fidelity. And really what this spurred in the broader landscape was exploration into new genres, new markets. So we saw the emergence of things like concept art, digital painting, web design, and as well as migration into video games. And so this is a familiar pattern. We saw this happen with the introduction of photography in the 1800s, where innovation reshaped artistic workflows and markets, but it coexisted with traditional forms. It wasn't necessarily displacing individuals, it was giving people more opportunities. So a broad question that emerges from this sort of analogy is, will generative AI mirror the trajectory of these past tools, augmenting, diversifying, but not necessarily displacing artists? And I think this is an interesting, we're at an interesting inflection point in the arts when we think about generative AI, because it can be characterized as a tool, but beyond that, we're seeing discussions about it as a collaborative partner, but at the extreme, even a end-to-end production pipeline in these creative domains. Now, before I even get into the research agenda, I first want to talk about the empirical settings that helps motivate some of the research questions that we have posed. So we're working with a large industry art platform intended for portfolio building, selling digital assets, as well as functioning as a labor market. Some important features of this are, because there are monetary incentives involved, the platform basically requires individuals to tag at the artwork level whether they use AI to generate any of their artifacts. Beyond that, exposure to major exogenous shocks. So, of course, we're talking about the release of text-to-image models in 2022, as well as the platform itself rolling out a policy that allowed artists to actually opt their individual artworks out from being included in future AI training data, whatever that means, if it's enforceable or not. But in terms of the scale of the data, we're working with over 8 million images, 200-something thousand unique artists, 13,000 of whom are AI-assisted creators, and 146,000 of them actually opt out at some point. And so that leads me to the research agenda. So our first question is simple. We want to understand who is actually engaging in this marketplace, who is actually responding to the introduction of generative AI and this opt-out policy on the platform. This will give us a sense of, sort of how is the composition of the market changing in the long run, for example. Second is specifically how are they responding? How are they responding in terms of their engagement on the platform, their market participation, the viewership that they're earning, as well as maybe potential strategic shifts in their production patterns in response to, say, AI threats to the organic artists. And then more broadly, at the macro level, can we say something about the implications on platform-level competition, the sustainability, the composition of users and artworks that persist in this labor market? Now, one thing we do want to exploit in this setting is uneven exposure to AI across different mediums, specifically 2D art and 3D art. So when we think about 2D art, we're talking about flat images produced in the likes of Photoshop, Procreate, things that look like photography, concept art, digital paintings. And so this is the domain that is readily replicable by the early text-to-image models. So this is sort of the treatment-exposed artistic medium. But when we think about 3D art, we're adding a depth dimension where you're able to basically pan around an object in space. So we're talking about 3D modeling, computer-generated imagery. And these are created using much more complex pipelines, as well as more complex software. So there's more steps to go from point A to point Z, getting something production ready. And really only until recently have we seen the emergence of AI models released to the public that are decently competent at producing 3D models from text or image. And so we consider the 3D art domain as sort of insulated from the AI threats. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the answer to our first research question because there's a lot of nuance to it, and I kind of want to treat it right now as a sanity check. So what we're able to do with this uneven exposure between 2D and 3D is basically identify artists who are specialized in 2D art, those who specialize in 3D art. And so basically what we find is, since there's no AI alternative for 3D artists to adopt, they don't adopt. But in terms of the actual opt-out decision, which it really is just revealing their preference to, say, data governance issues that emerge from this AI dilemma, we find that both of them are highly sensitive to this issue, but 2D artists especially so. Right? So that's sort of the one paragraph takeaway to the first research question, because I want to spend a lot more time talking about how market participation is actually changing in response to these dynamics, right? So for identification strategy, we're going to leverage this uneven exposure across 2D and 3D by basically saying the 2D artists, they constitute the treatment exposed. 3D artists, we can assume, would be the baseline of what would have happened if the non-adopters in 2D space sort of went about their lives as is. And the reason this is nice is because you might believe that 2D artists, if they're really fearful about this exposure, they might actually be reskilling and migrating into the 3D space. If we can show that there's no real difference between the 2D non-adopters and the 3D creators in the long run, then that sort of helps alleviate some of these concerns that come about from, say, stable treatment unit value assumption. And then we allow for an additional interaction between 2D specialists and adoption, so really to identify what is that impact on their participation in the marketplace or their productivity. So that gives us a triple DID. In terms of our outcome variables, we're looking at sort of posts as a way of measuring sort of this, participation in the marketplace, as well as engagement metrics. I'm not going to show those results, but I'll briefly describe them because they really mirror the main results. But here we're going to look at this black line here, right? So this is comparing the 2D non-adopters to the 3D creators. That's our first difference, right? So that's trying to alleviate these concerns that there's any sort of contamination or migration between the 2D and 3D space. If there was, we'd kind of see some perturbations here. Nicely, it sort of traces just the zero line, no significant differences between the two. But I want to highlight the difference, the trend for the green line, which is really comparing that adoption effect, right? So what happens to these individuals on the platform when they adopt AI? Well, this is no different from a lot of the AI productivity stuff that we've been seeing come out, but basically they just become much more productive, right? But in some sense, it's also talking about how much they're engaging on the platform, how much they're participating, and it's especially stark when we look at the next result, which is how are people engaging on the platform when they are sensitive to these data governance issues, right? People who opt out. What we find is, despite there being a bit of a positive, temporary effect early after the opt-out policy, really we see a precipitous drop in productivity among people who are sensitive to these AI data governance issues. And so it could be them, either they're reducing production or entirely leaving the platform. So when we put this result with the previous one, really now the market concentration is readily shifting to the AI-assisted creators and AI-assisted artifacts in this labor market. And we talk about engagement, so we're talking about viewership, we're talking about favorites. If we assume that there's a fixed number of eyeballs in any given period, then we also see basically the exact same thing here. We see that people who adopt AI, they're just netting much more of the intention on this platform, right? So essentially, market is readily shifting to the AI-assisted individuals. Attention as well. So in order for us to sort of dig deeper and understand what are sort of maybe the production level shifts, maybe people are strategically responding in how they're presenting their artworks or the types of things that they're creating. So I've been playing around with a method I call visual concept modeling, and the goal here is to identify these artifact level production shifts. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. This is sort of just a general overview. It's clustering, vision language models, separating out into the concept and visual space, plus large language models to basically allow us to recover in a scalable way prototypical artwork types. And this is nice because we can use these as outcome variables. So when we apply this to the 2D artifact space in our data set, we recover 20 unique artifact clusters over the visual concept space. And so we have them plotted here. And we're able now to estimate what is the pre to post change, shift in production for these AI-assisted artists relative to their non-adopter counterparts. And several interesting things emerge. You can probably just see this. The AI-assisted artists experience this raw production volume increase across the majority of their artifact types. But in terms of the actual concentration of this is actually ordered by prevalence of artifacts in this platform. So basically, we find that there's a concentration among the more common artifact types, which is speaking to a lot of the literature we're seeing about generative AI and reducing content diversity and things like that. So we find that story here. But it's not enough for us to say, this guy produced more of artifact type 0, right? So with this visual concept modeling approach, we can use vision language models and LLMs to iteratively characterize the different types of artworks that belong in each of these clusters, right? So I just provide some examples here. So we see Western style fantasy character designs highlighted in green for a reason that'll show up later. Mythical creatures in varied abstract styles, simple digital character portraits, action scenes with animated characters, and then anime-style character concepts. Right? So this nicely helps us characterize where exactly we're seeing maybe where AI is competent, right? Or maybe where people's preferences lie in terms of the types of content that they produce. But before I dig deeper into that, I want to show the result for what happens for these people who are sensitive to these data governance issues, right? So basically, we can vaguely see there's a general negative leaning on all these estimates, and in particular, the most common artifact type, right, cluster type 0. There seems to be more of a shift away from what they were previously producing. Is that a strategic response to, say, AI artists encroaching on their territory? Not sure, but at the very least, we see that they appear to be responding in some manner. But it's important to note that the magnitude of these production decreases are negligible relative to the gains showed by adopters. So there seems to be some inertia or maybe lack of awareness, lack of sensitivity to what's going on, or they're just trying to go about business as is. But an interesting thing is, with our visual concept modeling approach, we actually find that they start protesting against AI down here, right? Visual concept cluster 7. Basically, they're just trying to be vocal, protest on the platform, make a big deal about it. Now, when we look at how the actual composition of their portfolios changed across adopters and opt-out individuals from pre to post, basically what we see here, again, these two visual concepts are showing up again. Basically, where adopter production is shifting is basically being concentrated among the character categories, right? Character concepts, character designs, at the expense of largely much of the other content. Is that a matter of what AI is competent at, or is that where market demand sits? Again, that's sort of an open question. But when we look at the opt-out users, they seem to be a bit more moderate in how they're changing their portfolio composition. We do see that they are shifting away from the Western-style fantasy character designs, which, I guess they're responding in some way again. But I have a minute left, so let me just go on to the key takeaways. So again, I didn't show this result, but generally speaking, we're talking about 2D artists are leading the adoption because they actually have a tool to adopt, as well as opt out. They're very sensitive to these data governance issues that emerged from AI. 3D artists also exhibit sensitivity, but not to the same extent as their 2D counterparts. In terms of actual platform participation, we see that the 2D artists, the AI-assisted artists are flooding the market with artifacts. They're garnering more of the attention within any given period. And combine that with the fact that we see a lot of these AI-sensitive individuals leaving the marketplace, basically the whole market is shifting, right? It's shifting towards this AI domination. And lastly, we see that production shifts among the AI-assisted creators is mostly towards character design. Is that low-hanging fruit for them in the labor marketplace? Probably. But in terms of the AI-sensitive individuals, we see that they're trying to shift away, at least somewhat, from these character arts, as well as sort of this emergence of broader sort of ideological combat with sort of the AI bros, you could say, on these platforms. So. That's all I have for you today. If you're interested in reading my previous work, you can scan this funky QR code, but happy to answer any questions.
When you say the market, are we talking about a market where we can purchase digital art, or are we talking more generically?
So it functions as a market for purchasing digital art, but also there are potential employers that can hire you. So that's sort of why when we think about people leaving the marketplace, whereas all the AI artists are staying, concentrating, production is being concentrated among a select few, as well as them getting more viewership. That's sort of where we see probably client eyeballs are moving towards the AI artists as well. So that's sort of the broader story that is sort of emerging from this.
Is there a distinction between artists who are using AI to basically do their work for them versus artists who are using AI for the lines, for the depth, for the color contrast, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, so we can't actually distinguish between that. We kind of treat everyone agnostically as whether you are AI assisted or you're just an organic creator. I think at the very least, on average, the fact that we see these large effect sizes means that regardless of sort of how we designate your treatment assignment, that or the degree to which you use AI, there's still just this massive exodus of AI sensitive and sort of this mass concentration towards the AI assisted. So.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sure, Ming?
Yes, great presentation. I like the also content really interesting. The question about if those people in the treating group are forever treated or they can back out in the group?
Yeah, so we basically consider them as forever treated. We can run some robustness checks where we sort of allow that we could just call it like contamination, I guess you could say. But basically, the whole point of that was to show aggregate participation, right? So even if, say, somebody used AI once and then they never used it again and they sort of continue participating as normal, I would venture to guess that would more likely attenuate our results than to sort of bias our results upwards.
Also, you may look at this splitting of data into the first time traded versus later time traded.
Yeah.
That was tell a little bit more about their mechanism.
Yeah.
Whether this top artists are really they are changing the style, or maybe really many of the artists or the artists production. So you can get some novelty or difference between the earlier versus the later.
Mm-hmm.
Once adopted the AI, what's the embedding stage or the distance from the larger distance between the self-past art produced versus the peers.
Mm-hmm.
So that will give you some kind of hint of the mechanism, the novelty, creativity getting better, or different.
Yeah. No, I agree. And that's largely what a lot of my previous work has done, so that's kind of why I didn't focus on that here, but I agree. That is definitely one additional analysis that can be done.
In regards to the 2D artists that were part of the study, do you know what kind of art was being produced? Was it mainly character digital? Was any of it higher DPI for billboards or packaging? And I ask because typically 2D artists that solely focus on digital art that isn't printed or isn't going to packaging, there's just two very different styles, and the DPI has to be higher to print. Did you notice any nuances and where it was whether it was applied more to the digital art versus packaging, billboard, and so forth?
Yeah, so we do have that granularity in our data. We do have people who sort of specialize in marketing material. We do have people who do photography. Part of the nuance with the whole selection estimation, the answer to the first question, comes from sort of maybe these different specializations. So I didn't have enough time to go over that. But I also haven't had enough time to even look into that question itself. But that's definitely something that I want to look into for the future steps. So sorry I don't have a better answer for you.
All good.